The first sound was panic. Drawers slamming, footsteps running, someone shouting,
"Where is it?"
At the time, I didn't know what they were looking for. I would learn later it was the proof they never thought I had. They should know what you really are. Respect isn't automatic, it's earned. Her voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone people use when they've already decided they're right. She didn't shout, that would have been crude. Instead, she smiled, small, deliberate, and let the words settle into the space between us like poison in still water. I was holding a teacup. I remember that. My hand tightened around the porcelain, and for a moment I thought it might crack. The sound of her spit hitting the hardwood floor came next. Soft, wet, intimate in a way that made my skin crawl. The children froze. I watched their small bodies go rigid, their breath caught somewhere between shock and confusion. That pause, that half-second of silence was the point. She wanted them to see it. I turned away. I didn't speak. At the time, I thought silence was dignity. I thought if I stayed quiet, stayed composed, I would somehow win. What I didn't understand then was that silence in the wrong hands looks like permission.
It was supposed to be a good day. My son David and his family had driven in for Sunday brunch, something we'd done for years. I'd set the table the night before, white linen, the good china, fresh flowers from the garden. I'd even made cinnamon rolls from scratch, the way my grandson, Ethan, loved them. The house smelled like butter and sugar and something close to happiness. I thought we were celebrating. My granddaughter, Lily, had just been accepted into a gifted program at school. I'd sent a card. I'd told her how proud I was. When they arrived, she hugged me tightly, and for a moment, everything felt right. But then, my daughter-in-law, Claire, set her purse down on the counter. She pulled out a folder, the kind with a clip at the top, official-looking. She didn't hand it to me. She placed it on the table, right next to the platter of rolls, and said, "We need to talk about boundaries." Boundaries. That word had been appearing more and more lately, always in her mouth, always delivered with the same reasonable tone, as if she were a school counselor and I were a child who'd misbehaved. I asked what she meant. She said the children had been confused by some of the things I'd told them, that I'd given advice that contradicted what she and David had decided, that I didn't understand modern parenting. I didn't argue. I asked for an example. She opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, screenshots of text messages, notes I'd left for the children in their lunchboxes. She'd kept all of it, organized, dated. "This," she said, holding up a note I'd written to Ethan after he'd had a rough day at school, "this tells him he's perfect the way he is, but we're trying to teach him accountability, growth mindset. You're undermining that." The note had said, "You're braver than you think. Grandma loves you." I looked at my son. He was staring at his plate, silent, neutral, performatively absent. I said, quietly, that I didn't think a grandmother's love was the same as undermining authority. That's when she said it, the line that would replay in my head for weeks. They should know what you really are. Respect isn't automatic, it's earned. And then she spat. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I excused myself from the table and walked upstairs to my bedroom. I closed the door gently, the way I'd been trained to do my whole life, the way women like me always do. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds below. Silverware on plates, low voices, Ethan asking where I'd gone, Claire's response too quiet to hear, but easy enough to imagine. At the time, I thought that if I just gave them space, if I just stayed out of the way, things would smooth over. I thought endurance was strength. What I didn't realize was that staying quiet had made me disappear.
Later, after they left, I found the folder still on the table. She'd forgotten it, or maybe she'd left it on purpose. I wasn't sure which was worse. I opened it again, slowly, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. At the bottom of the stack was a letter addressed to the school counselor. It mentioned concerns about parental alienation and inconsistent messaging. It mentioned my name, my habits, my intrusive involvement. It was dated 3 weeks ago. They'd been building a case against me in secret while I baked cinnamon rolls and told my grandchildren they were loved. I closed the folder, I set it on the kitchen counter, and I stood there in the empty house, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't a conflict. It was a war I hadn't known I was fighting, and I'd already lost the first battle by refusing to see it. But wars don't end with the first defeat. I walked to my bedroom closet and pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were things I'd been keeping without quite knowing why. Dated notes, printed emails with CC lines intact, copies of school forms, HOA documents, insurance papers. She used to mock my habit. "You still trust hard copies?" she'd ask, as if memory were somehow more reliable than ink. I didn't answer her then, but as I opened that box and saw the careful, chronological order of everything inside, I understood something I hadn't before. Silence was never weakness. It was evidence waiting to be used. And now the waiting was over. What happened next would take weeks to unfold, but in that moment, standing alone in my bedroom with a box full of paper and a heart full of something I didn't yet have a name for, I made a choice. I would not disappear. Not anymore. The first sound came at 11:47 that night. I know the time because I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The house was dark, quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you hear your own heartbeat. Then I heard it, a car door slamming, footsteps rushing up the front walk, keys scraping against the lock. David and his family lived 20 minutes away. They'd left hours ago. The door opened. I heard Claire's voice, sharp and urgent, cutting through the stillness. She wasn't speaking to anyone. She was searching. I stayed in bed, listening. Drawers slid open in the kitchen, hard, fast, the sound of papers shuffling. Something fell. A cabinet door banged shut. "Where is it?" she said. Not a question, a demand made to the empty air. More footsteps, heavier now. My son's voice, low and confused. "What are you looking for?" "The folder," she said. "The one I brought this morning. I left it here." At the time, I didn't move. I lay there in the dark, my hands folded on top of the blanket, and I listened to her tear through my kitchen. I thought about going downstairs. I thought about calling out, letting them know I was awake. But something stopped me. Looking back now, I understand what that something was. Instinct, the quiet animal sense that if I revealed myself too soon, I would lose something I didn't yet know I had. So I stayed still, and I listened. "It's not here," David said after a few minutes. His voice sounded tired, resigned. "It has to be," her tone sharpened. "I left it on the table, right next to the—" She stopped. "Did she take it?" Silence. "Did your mother take my folder?" "Why would she take it?" David sounded genuinely confused. "She doesn't even know what's in it." "Doesn't she?" Claire's voice dropped. Colder now, more controlled. "She's been acting strange for months, hovering, asking questions, taking notes." I heard David exhale. "She's a librarian. She takes notes on everything." Exactly. The word landed like a verdict. She documents, she saves things. She's been building something and I didn't see it. That was when I realized she was afraid. Not angry, not inconvenienced. Afraid. The panic in her voice wasn't about losing a folder, it was about losing control of what that folder represented, the narrative, the version of events she'd been carefully constructing. At the time, I didn't fully understand why, but I felt it, the shift. The air in the house changed, like pressure dropping before a storm. They searched for another 10 minutes. I heard them move through the downstairs rooms, the living room, the den. At one point, footsteps paused outside my bedroom door. I held my breath. The handle didn't turn. After a moment, the footsteps moved away. Eventually, they left. The front door closed. The car started. Taillights swept across my bedroom wall as they backed out of the driveway. I lay there for another hour, staring at nothing, replaying the sounds in my head. She's been building something and I didn't see it. I hadn't been building anything, not consciously, but she believed I had, and in believing it, she'd revealed something critical. She thought I was a threat.
The next morning, I found the folder where I'd left it. On the kitchen counter, tucked beneath a dish towel. I'd moved it there after they left the first time, out of sight, without really thinking about why. Now, I opened it again, slowly, and I looked at the contents with new eyes. The emails, the screenshots, the notes. They weren't just records of my behavior. They were a framework, a case being built in real time. And at the bottom, beneath the letter to the school counselor, was something I hadn't noticed before. A draft, handwritten, dated 2 days ago. It was addressed to a family court mediator. The words blurred for a moment as I read them. Concerns about unsupervised access, patterns of boundary violations, in the best interest of the children. She was preparing to remove me, legally, formally, not through an argument or a conversation, but through institutions, through paperwork and official channels where my voice wouldn't carry. I set the folder down. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I'd spent my whole life believing that if you were kind, if you were patient, if you stayed quiet and caused no trouble, people would treat you fairly. I'd believed in good faith, in the benefit of the doubt. What I understood now, standing in my kitchen with that folder in front of me, was that good faith is a luxury only the person in power can afford. She didn't need my good faith. She had the structure, the language, the systems. All I had was paper. But paper, it turned out, could be enough. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, and I did what I'd always done when things got complicated. I organized. I pulled out the box from my closet. I spread the contents across the table. Emails with timestamps, notes with dates, consent forms with signatures, some mine, some not, HOA correspondence, insurance claims, medical visit logs. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with them, but I knew, with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, that I needed to understand what I had. So I started reading, chronologically, from the beginning. And as I read, patterns emerged. Decisions made without consulting me, appointments scheduled without my knowledge, consent forms signed in my name. Little things at first, easy to miss, easy to explain away as miscommunication or oversight. But when you line them up, one after another, they stop looking like mistakes. They start looking like a system. By mid-morning, my coffee had gone cold. I'd filled 3 pages with notes, dates, names, inconsistencies. That's when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but the number looked familiar, a local area code. I picked up. Mrs. Whitman? The voice was hesitant, female, older.
This is Margaret Chen from the HOA archives. I knew Margaret, not well, but enough to nod to at neighborhood meetings. She was quiet, meticulous, the kind of person who kept records because she believed in fairness. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, "but something came across my desk yesterday and I wasn't sure if you knew about it." My grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of something?" "A filing for guardianship documentation. It had your name on it, but your signature wasn't where it should have been." The room tilted slightly. I sat down. "What do you mean?" I asked. "There's a request," Margaret said carefully, "to update emergency contact forms for your grandchildren. Your name was listed as removed, replaced with someone else, but there's no record of you consenting to that." I closed my eyes. "When was this filed?" 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The same date as the letter to the school counselor, the same date as the draft to the mediator. It wasn't panic. It was a plan. And I hadn't even known I was being erased. "Mrs. Whitman?" Margaret's voice pulled me back. "Are you still there?" "Yes," I said. "I'm here." "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I thought you should know." "Thank you," I told her, and I meant it. After I hung up, I sat at the table for a long time. The papers were still spread out in front of me. The folder, the notes, the evidence I hadn't known I was collecting. I thought about Claire's voice the night before, the fear in it, the certainty. She's been building something, and I didn't see it. She'd been right, just not in the way she thought. I hadn't been building a case. I'd been living my life, keeping records because that's what librarians do, because order matters, because memory fades, but ink doesn't. But now, looking at everything in front of me, I realized something. Intention doesn't matter, only evidence does. And I had more evidence than she knew. The question wasn't whether I would use it. The question was when, and how much she would lose when I finally did. The box had been in my closet for 7 years. I'd packed it after my husband died, not because I thought I'd need it, but because throwing things away felt wrong, too final, like erasing evidence that we'd existed at all. Inside were things most people would call clutter, utility bills with handwritten notes in the margins, copies of school permission slips, email printouts from parent-teacher conferences, receipts for birthday gifts I'd bought the children, each one dated and stapled to a small card describing what I'd given them and why. My daughter-in-law used to laugh at my filing system. "You're like a museum curator," she'd say. "Who keeps paper anymore?" I'd smile and say nothing. "Old habits die hard," I'd tell myself. "Librarians never throw anything away." At the time, I thought she found it charming, quirky, a harmless eccentricity. Looking back now, I realized she found it threatening, because paper doesn't forget, and neither do I. I spent 3 days going through everything. The dining table disappeared beneath stacks of documents. I sorted them by year first, then by category: correspondence, medical, financial, legal, each pile growing larger as I worked. My hands moved automatically. This was what I did for 40 years: organize information, make sense of chaos, find the patterns hidden in plain sight. And the patterns were everywhere. An email from 3 years ago, Claire asking if I could take the children to their dentist appointments. I'd said yes. I'd written the dates in my planner. I'd driven them myself and waited in the lobby while they got their cleanings. 2 years later, another email, this one to the insurance company, claiming I'd been inconsistent with medical follow-ups, suggesting I was no longer reliable for healthcare decisions. But I had the receipts, the appointment cards, the follow-up notes from the dentist, addressed to me, proof that I'd done exactly what I'd been asked to do. She'd rewritten history, quietly, methodically, turning my help into evidence of my failure. I set the documents side by side. The contradiction was stark, undeniable. At the time, I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet, something closer to recognition. This was deliberate. I found more. A consent form for Ethan's field trip to the Science Museum. I'd signed it, but there was another copy in Claire's handwriting, submitted 2 days later, noting that I'd forgotten to return the original. I had returned it. I'd handed it directly to the teacher. I even had a thank you email from the teacher confirming receipt. But Claire's version became the official record, the one that framed me as forgetful, unreliable, slipping. There were more examples, dozens, small distortions that seemed innocent on their own, but together they formed something unmistakable. A narrative, carefully constructed, brick by brick, and I'd been too trusting to see it. On the 4th day, I found the photographs. They were in an envelope at the bottom of the box. Pictures from the children's birthday parties, holiday dinners, ordinary moments I'd nearly forgotten. In one photo, Ethan was holding a drawing he'd made for me at school, a stick figure grandmother with a book in her lap. He'd written, "I love Grandma," in careful, crooked letters across the top. In another, Lily was asleep on my couch, her head resting on my shoulder. I remembered that afternoon. She'd been upset about something at school. She'd asked if she could stay with me instead of going home. I'd said yes. Of course I'd said yes. But later, my daughter-in-law had called it undermining parental authority. She'd said I was teaching the children to run away from problems instead of facing them. I looked at the photo, Lily's face, peaceful and safe, my hand resting gently on her hair. That wasn't undermining, that was love. But love, I was learning, could be reframed as interference. Kindness could be reframed as control. And if you controlled the language, you controlled the truth. I set the photo down carefully. My hands were shaking now. Not from fear, from clarity. The doorbell rang that afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, I considered not answering, but the bell rang again, softer this time, polite, patient. I opened the door. It was Margaret from the HOA. She was holding a small folder, her expression cautious, apologetic. "I'm sorry to bother you again," she said, "but I found something else, and I thought you should see it before anyone else does." I stepped aside. She came in. We sat at the kitchen table. She placed the folder in front of me, but didn't open it. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. "There's a petition," she said quietly, "submitted last week, to restrict access to certain community facilities, playgrounds, the rec center. It mentions your name specifically." I stared at her. "Why?" "It cites safety concerns." Her voice was careful, neutral. "Behavioral unpredictability, unsupervised interactions with minors." The words hit like stones, cold, hard, precise. "I've never," I started, but Margaret raised her hand gently. "I know," she said. "I've been on the board for 12 years. I've seen you with those children. I know what kind of person you are." She opened the folder. Inside was a copy of the petition, and at the bottom, 3 signatures. Claire's was first, neat, confident, underlined twice. Below it, 2 neighbors I barely knew, strangers recruited to validate a lie. "She's building a public record," she said. "Not just within your family, she's expanding it, making it institutional." I looked at the petition. The language was clinical, detached. It didn't mention any specific incidents. It didn't need to. The implication alone was enough. Once you're accused, Even baselessly, the accusation becomes part of your file, your reputation, your legacy. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Margaret hesitated. Then she said, "Because I don't think she should get away with it."
After Margaret left, I sat at the table for a long time. The documents were still spread across the surface, years of my life reduced to paper and ink, evidence of care, of presence, of showing up when I was asked and staying quiet when I was dismissed. I'd thought silence was dignity. I'd thought if I didn't make trouble, I'd be treated fairly. But fairness, I understood now, isn't something you earn through good behavior. It's something you fight for, with precision, with evidence, with the same cold, methodical patience that had been used against me. I picked up Margaret's folder. I placed it at the center of the table, surrounded by everything else I'd collected, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than confusion or grief. I felt ready. That night, I couldn't sleep again, but this time, it wasn't fear keeping me awake. It was planning. I lay in the dark and mentally retraced every document I'd reviewed, every email, every note, every dated, signed, undeniable piece of proof that contradicted the story Claire had been telling. She'd underestimated me. She'd seen an old woman who kept paper and assumed it was nostalgia, sentiment, a harmless quirk. She hadn't considered that records are power, that documentation is a weapon, that silence, kept long enough, becomes leverage. At the time, I didn't know exactly how I would use what I had, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had built a case against me in the shadows, quietly, strategically, without my knowledge. Now, it was my turn.
The next morning, I made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, not yet. There was someone I needed to speak to first. Someone who could confirm what I'd started to suspect but hadn't been willing to name out loud. I dialed the number for the school counselor, the one Claire had written to weeks ago, the one whose name appeared on multiple documents in that folder. The receptionist answered. I gave my name. There was a pause. Then she said, "Mrs. Whitman, we've been expecting your call." My breath caught. "You have?" "Yes," she said. "We received some concerning correspondence recently about your involvement with your grandchildren. We'd like to schedule a meeting to clarify a few things." I closed my eyes. So it had gone further than I thought, further than the HOA, further than family. It had reached the school, the institution my grandchildren trusted, the place where their records would follow them for years. "I'd be happy to meet," I said. My voice was steady, calm. "And I'll be bringing documentation." There was silence on the other end. Then, carefully, the receptionist said, "Documentation?" "Yes," I said. "Quite a lot of it, actually." When I hung up, I looked at the table, at the stacks of paper, at the years of proof. She'd tried to bury me in silence, but silence, it turned out, was the one thing I'd been saving all along, and now I was ready to let it speak.
Margaret came back 3 days later. This time she didn't knock. She rang the bell once and waited. When I opened the door, she was holding a larger folder, thicker than before. Her face looked tired. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know I've already imposed, but there's more." I stepped aside without speaking. She came in and set the folder on the table, now cleared of my documents. I'd packed everything away the night before, organized it into labeled binders. Ready. Margaret sat down heavily. She looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing her clearly for the first time. "I've been going through the archives," she said.
cross-referencing names, dates, looking for inconsistencies. "Why?" I asked. She looked at me directly. "Because I've seen this before." Margaret told me about another woman, a neighbor who'd lived 2 streets over, 5 years ago. The woman's daughter-in-law had filed similar complaints: boundary violations, unsafe behavior, emotional instability. The language had been almost identical to what I'd seen in my own documents. "What happened to her?" I asked. Margaret's jaw tightened. She moved away, out of state, said she couldn't stand the whispers anymore, the looks at the grocery store, the way people crossed the street when they saw her coming. "Did anyone ever prove the accusations?" "No." Margaret's voice was flat. "But they didn't need to. Once the idea is planted, it grows on its own, especially when it's about children. People would rather be cautious than fair." I sat back. The chair creaked softly. "So she just left?" "She didn't have evidence," Margaret said. "Nothing concrete. It was her word against a younger woman's, and younger women, especially mothers, always sound more credible." She opened the folder she'd brought. Inside were copies of HOA meeting minutes, email chains, petition signatures, all dated from that earlier case, all following the same pattern I was seeing now. "I kept everything," Margaret said quietly, "because something about it felt wrong. But I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't think anyone would care." She looked at me. "Then I saw your name on that petition, and I realized it was happening again." At the time, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to thank her. Part of me felt sick, realizing this was a strategy, a repeatable pattern, not personal malice, but calculated erasure. "Why didn't you speak up before?" I asked. It came out harder than I meant. Margaret flinched slightly. "I tried. At a board meeting, I questioned the legitimacy of the complaints, asked for specific incidents, dates, witnesses." "What happened?" "I was told I was being insensitive, that questioning victims was harmful, that I needed to think about the children's safety." Her voice went quiet. "So I stopped asking." I understood then. Margaret hadn't been silent because she was cowardly. She'd been silent because the language had been weaponized. Questions became accusations. Skepticism became cruelty. "But you're asking now," I said. "Because you have proof." She gestured toward where my binders had been. "The other woman didn't. You do. That changes things." We spent the next 2 hours going through everything. Margaret had brought copies of the previous case. I laid them next to my own documents. The parallels were striking. Even the wording was similar. Behavioral unpredictability, inconsistent messaging, best interest of the children. It was a template, a script. "She's done this before," I said, not a question. Margaret nodded. "Or learned it from someone who had. These phrases don't come from nowhere. They're institutional, legal, designed to sound official." "Where did she learn it?" "I don't know. But look at this. The petition signatures from 5 years ago. 2 of them appear on your petition too." I looked at the names. Neighbors I'd never spoken to. People I didn't know. They're what I call professional validators. People who sign things without reading them, who trust that if someone asks, it must be legitimate. Why would they do that? Because it costs them nothing, and it makes them look concerned, engaged, like good neighbors who care about safety. The weight of it settled over me. This wasn't just Claire. This was a system, a network of people who participated without thinking, who added their names to documents because it felt righteous, because it was easier than asking questions. Margaret left late that afternoon. Before she went, she turned back at the door. "There's a board meeting next Thursday," she said. "The petition will be on the agenda. They'll vote on whether to approve the restrictions. What happens if they do? You'll be banned from community spaces, publicly, on record. It won't be criminal, but it'll be permanent, and it'll follow you. I felt the air thin slightly. How do I stop it? She attends the meeting, she said, and you bring your evidence. All of it. You make them see what she's doing. Will they listen? Margaret paused. Her expression was difficult to read. I don't know, but you have something the other woman didn't. You have documentation, and you have me. She left before I could ask what she meant by that. That night, I opened the binders again. I reviewed every page, every email, every receipt and note and timestamp. I rehearsed in my head how I would present them, calmly, factually, without emotion. But beneath the planning there was something else, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel until now. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, enduring kind that comes from realizing you've been erased systematically, strategically, by someone who smiled at you while doing it. Claire had built this campaign not out of cruelty, but out of convenience. I was in the way. I asked questions. I remembered things. I had relationships with the children that didn't depend on her mediation. So I needed to be removed. Not violently, not dramatically, just quietly, through paperwork, through whispers, through the slow accumulation of official doubt. At the time, I didn't realize how much I'd been absorbing, how much silence I'd swallowed, how many small humiliations I'd dismissed as misunderstandings. Looking back now, I see it clearly. She hadn't just tried to remove me from my grandchildren's lives. She'd tried to make me remove myself. The meeting was 6 days away. I spent that week preparing, not just organizing documents, but anticipating objections, preparing for dismissals, for the possibility that even with evidence, I wouldn't be believed. Because that was the real risk, not that I didn't have proof, but that proof wouldn't matter. Margaret had said it herself, when it's about children, people would rather be cautious than fair. So I needed to make fairness unavoidable. I needed to make the facts so clear, so undeniable, that ignoring them would be a choice, a deliberate act of complicity. I worked late into the night, printing, labeling, creating packets for each board member, evidence organized chronologically, emails with full headers, receipts with dates highlighted, consent forms showing signature order. By Thursday morning, I had 12 identical packets, one for each board member, one for the record, and one extra, just in case. I dressed carefully that day, a simple blouse, neutral slacks, nothing that could be read as aggressive or emotional. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a woman who kept records. I arrived at the community center 20 minutes early. The meeting room was already half full. I recognized most of the faces, neighbors I'd waved to for decades, people I'd brought casseroles to when they were sick, people I'd helped when they'd needed a hand. Margaret was already seated near the front. She glanced at me, but didn't smile. Professional, appropriate. I took a seat in the back, and I waited. The meeting started on time. Budget reports, landscaping proposals, routine business that took nearly an hour. Then the board chair cleared his throat. "Next item," he said, "community safety petition regarding restricted access for certain residents." My heart slowed, not from fear, from focus. The chair began reading the petition aloud, my name, the accusations, the request for restrictions. He didn't look at me. No one did. When he finished, he asked if anyone wanted to speak in favor of the petition. A hand went up. Claire stood, calm, composed, dressed like she'd come from a professional conference. She walked to the front with a folder of her own. She didn't look at me either, and when she began speaking, her voice was smooth, rational, concerned. She opened her folder. "I have documentation," she said. And that's when I realized something that made my hands go cold. She'd brought her own evidence, and I had no idea what was in it.
She spoke for 8 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall. Each minute stretched longer than the last. Her voice never wavered, never rose. She sounded like a guidance counselor delivering difficult news with appropriate concern. "I want to emphasize," she said, "that Mrs. Whitman has done nothing criminal, nothing overtly harmful, but patterns don't always announce themselves loudly." She held up her first document, a printed email. "This is from 18 months ago. Mrs. Whitman offered to pick up the children from school without asking permission first, just informed us it was done." A murmur rippled through the room. I felt it rather than heard it, the subtle shift of bodies in chairs, people leaning slightly forward. She continued, "Here's another, a birthday gift given to my daughter. Expensive, far beyond what we'd discussed as appropriate. When I raised concerns, Mrs. Whitman said she didn't need permission to love her grandchildren." The way she said it made love sound like an accusation, like something dangerous disguised as affection. At the time, I wanted to stand up, to interrupt, to explain that the gift was a microscope Lily had wanted for months, that I'd saved for it, that the joy on her face when she opened it was worth every penny. But I stayed seated. I'd learned by then that interrupting only makes you look defensive, guilty. Looking back now, I realized she was counting on that, on my silence, on my belief that facts would speak for themselves. She pulled out more documents, a calendar showing the days I'd had the children. "Notice the frequency," she said, "sometimes 3, 4 times a week, far more than typical grandparent involvement." Someone in the front row nodded. "And here," she continued, "medical visit logs. Mrs. Whitman took Ethan to a doctor's appointment, but she didn't inform us until afterwards. We had no idea what was discussed, what medications might have been prescribed." That wasn't true. I'd called them immediately after, left a voicemail with the doctor's recommendations. But the voicemail wasn't in her folder, just the appointment record, the fact stripped of context. She was building a portrait, not with lies exactly, but with absences, facts presented in a way that created a shadow where I should have been. "I'm not saying Mrs. Whitman is malicious," she said. Her voice softened, sympathetic even. "I'm saying she's unable to respect boundaries, and when someone can't respect boundaries with children, we have to take that seriously." The board chair nodded slowly, others followed. I felt the room tilting, not toward anger, toward consensus, toward the easier choice, the one that required no conflict, just quiet agreement that caution was always safer than trust. When she finished, the chair thanked her. Then he looked at the room. "Does anyone wish to speak in opposition to the petition?" Silence. I counted 3 seconds before I stood. Every head turned. Some faces I recognized, some I didn't, all of them waiting, watching to see if I would shout, if I would cry, if I would prove everything she'd just implied about my instability. I walked to the front. My hands were steady. I was carrying my own folder, thicker than hers, heavier. I set it on the table. The sound was solid, final. "My name is Eleanor Whitman," I said, "and I'd like to present some additional context." The chair looked uncertain. "Mrs. Whitman, we've already heard—" "Documents," I said, not loudly, but clearly.
I have documents, dates, signatures, full email chains, not excerpts, complete records. He hesitated, then nodded. Proceed.
I opened the folder. The first page was the email my daughter-in-law had referenced, the one about picking up the children from school, but this version included the full chain. Her original message, sent 2 days earlier, asking if I could help because she had work conflict, my response, confirming I could, her reply, "Thank you, you're a lifesaver." I held it up. This is the complete exchange. I didn't offer without permission. I was asked, and I responded. I placed it on the table and pulled out the next document, the birthday gift receipt, with a card still attached, in my granddaughter's handwriting. "Dear Grandma, I'll use this every day. Thank you for believing I could be a scientist." This wasn't excessive indulgence. This was supporting a child's dream, with her parents' knowledge. I sent a text before purchasing. "It's here, time-stamped." I kept going. Medical visit logs, with copies of the voicemails I'd left, transcribed by the phone company, time-stamped again. Calendars showing not just when I had the children, but who had requested my help. Email after email. "Can you take them Tuesday? We need a sitter Friday. Would you mind keeping them overnight?" Each request followed by my agreement, each instance of care preceded by permission. At the time, I wasn't thinking about vindication. I was thinking about accuracy, about making the shape of the truth visible when someone had tried to obscure it. Looking back now, I realized I was also thinking about the woman Margaret had told me about, the one who'd left, who'd had no evidence, who believed that decency alone would be enough. I wasn't going to be her. The room had gone very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system humming. Someone coughed softly. Pages rustled as board members flipped through the packets I'd prepared, identical copies I'd placed at each seat before the meeting started. My daughter-in-law was still standing near the front. Her face was composed, but her hands had tightened around her own folder, the edges crumpled slightly. The board chair cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitman, these are extensive. They're complete. Every interaction, every request, every response. I kept records because I was a librarian for 40 years. It's what I do." He nodded slowly. Then he looked at my daughter-in-law. "Miss Patterson, did you have access to these full exchanges when you compiled your documentation?" Her jaw tightened, just slightly. "I provided what was relevant to the pattern of behavior. But you didn't include the requests you made, the permissions you gave." "I didn't think they were necessary," she said. Her voice was still calm, still controlled. "The concern isn't whether she was asked, it's whether the frequency itself created dependency." It was a good pivot, I had to admit that. She was trying to reframe the question, to move away from facts and back toward interpretation. But the chair wasn't letting her. "The frequency was at your request." She didn't answer. Margaret spoke next. She stood and addressed the board directly. "I've reviewed the archives," she said. "This petition follows the same language as one filed 5 years ago, against a different resident. That petition was approved. The resident moved away shortly after." She placed her folder on the table next to mine. "I've brought those records, for comparison. The language is nearly identical. The structure is the same. And in both cases, the accusations relied on selective presentation." The room shifted again, this time away from my daughter-in-law, toward uncertainty, toward the realization that what had seemed simple was actually complicated. The chair looked tired suddenly.
"This board doesn't make decisions lightly," he said, "but we also don't make them without all available information." He paused. Then he said, "I'm tabling this petition, pending further review. We'll revisit it at next month's meeting." It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it wasn't a defeat either. It was time, space, room to breathe. People filed out slowly after the meeting ended. Some glanced at me, some didn't. Margaret touched my shoulder briefly as she passed, a wordless acknowledgement. My daughter-in-law stayed near the front. She was putting papers back in her folder, methodical, unhurried. Then she looked at me, directly, for the first time that night. Her expression wasn't angry, it was something colder, more calculating. She walked toward me, stopped a few feet away. "You think this is over," she said quietly. I didn't respond. "It's not." Her voice was still calm, still measured. "You've made this public now. You've involved the community, the school, the institutions." She stepped closer. "They'll have to choose sides, and when they do, they'll choose the mother. They always do." She turned to leave, then paused. "I was trying to do this quietly, for everyone's sake, but you've changed the terms." She left without waiting for an answer. I stood in the empty room for a long time after everyone had gone. The packets were still on the table, evidence scattered like puzzle pieces, proof that I'd told the truth. But her words echoed in the silence. "They'll have to choose sides." At the time, I thought I'd won something by presenting my case, by showing the facts, by refusing to disappear quietly. Looking back now, I understand what she meant. This wasn't a battle about truth anymore. It was a battle about who would be believed. And belief, I was learning, doesn't always follow evidence. Sometimes it follows comfort, safety, the path of least resistance. And she was betting that when people had to choose between an old woman with records and a young mother with children, they'd choose her. The meeting was in 30 days, and I had no idea what she would bring next. But I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever it was, it would be designed to make the truth irrelevant. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was washing breakfast dishes when the phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Mrs. Whitman?" The voice was young, female, professional. "This is Jennifer Moss from Child Protective Services." The dish I was holding slipped. It didn't break, just landed in the sink with a dull thud. Water splashed onto my sleeve. "Yes?" I said. My voice sounded far away. "We've received a report concerning your interactions with your grandchildren. I'd like to schedule a time to speak with you, at your home if possible." At the time, I couldn't speak. My throat had closed. My hands were wet and shaking. Looking back now, I understand that moment differently. It wasn't shock. It was recognition. The daughter-in-law had found her answer. When evidence failed, she'd escalated. She'd moved the battlefield to a place where accusation alone carried weight. "When?" I asked. "Friday afternoon, 2 o'clock. Does that work?" I said yes, because what else could I say? I called Margaret immediately after hanging up. She answered on the second ring. I told her what happened. There was a long pause. "She filed a CPS report," Margaret said. "Not a question, a statement of fact." "Can she do that?" "Anyone can file a report," Margaret said. "Not a question, a statement of fact." "Anyone can file a report," Margaret said. "CPS is required to investigate every claim, even baseless ones." "But I have documentation," I said. "Proof that everything she said is misleading." "It doesn't matter." Margaret spoke carefully, precisely. CPS doesn't weigh evidence the way courts do. They assess risk, and the presence of conflict itself registers as risk, especially with an elderly caregiver. The words landed heavily. Elderly caregiver, as if my age automatically made me suspect, fragile, potentially dangerous. "What do I do?" I asked. "You cooperate fully," she said. "You stay calm, you provide documentation if asked, and you understand that this is a tactic. She's trying to make you defensive, to make you look unstable." "How do I prove I'm not unstable?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "You can't prove a negative. That's the point." I spent the next 3 days preparing. Not frantically, methodically. I cleaned the house, not because it was dirty, but because I knew they'd be looking for signs. Clutter, disorganization, anything that could be photographed and reinterpreted later. I gathered more documents, medical records showing I was in good health, character references from neighbors, letters from the children's teachers thanking me for volunteering, everything I could think of that might demonstrate competence, stability, safety. But even as I organized, I felt something shifting inside me, a realization that no amount of paper would be enough, because this wasn't about facts anymore. It was about perception, about who looked more credible in a system designed to err on the side of caution. And caution, I was learning, always favors the younger parent. Jennifer Moss arrived exactly at 2 o'clock. She was in her 30s, neat blazer, clipboard, kind eyes that didn't quite reach her smile. She introduced herself and asked if she could come in. I led her to the living room. She sat on the couch and pulled out a form. "I want to be clear," she said. "This isn't an interrogation. It's a safety assessment. Standard procedure." Standard procedure. The phrase made my skin prickle, as if what was happening to me was routine, unremarkable. She asked questions. How often did I see the children? What activities did we do? Had there ever been any incidents, any conflicts? I answered each question carefully, honestly. I offered documentation when relevant, time-stamped photos, emails from my son thanking me for helping, receipts for activities we'd done together. She took notes, nodded occasionally. Her face revealed nothing. Then she asked, "Has anyone expressed concerns about your ability to care for the children?" I paused. At the time, I wasn't sure how to answer. If I said no, I'd be lying. If I said yes, I'd be confirming there was a problem. Looking back now, I see the trap. The question was designed to be unanswerable. Either response could be used against me. "My daughter-in-law has raised concerns," I said, "but those concerns are contradicted by documented evidence." Jennifer wrote something down. "What kind of concerns?" "Boundary violations, frequency of contact, undermining parental authority." I kept my voice level. But each instance she's cited was preceded by her explicit request for help. "Do you have proof of those requests?" "Yes." I handed her a binder, the same one I'd presented at the board meeting. "Everything is here, complete email chains, text messages, phone logs." She flipped through it, slowly. Her expression didn't change. "This is very thorough," she said finally. I couldn't tell if that was good or bad. She asked to see the children's rooms, the spaces they used when they stayed with me. I led upstairs, 2 small bedrooms, each with a bed, a nightstand, a bookshelf. Clean, ordered, safe. She looked around, opened the closet, checked the window locks, made notes. "Do the children stay here often?" she asked. "I used to," I said, "several times a month, less frequently now." "Why less frequently?" she asked. "Her mother has limited contact," I said. without emotion, just fact. Jennifer turned to face me. Why do you think she's done that? Another trap. If I said she was trying to erase me, I'd sound paranoid. If I said I didn't know, I'd sound oblivious. You'd have to ask her, I said. She wrote something else, then she closed her notebook. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Whitman, she said. I'll be filing my report within 10 days. You'll receive a copy. What happens then? I asked. That depends on the findings. Her tone was carefully neutral. But in cases like this, where there's documented conflict between family members, we typically recommend mediation or supervised contact. Supervised contact. The word struck like a hammer, as if I were a criminal, a threat. I've done nothing wrong, I said, quietly but clearly. I'm not making that determination, she said. I'm just documenting what I observe. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was silent. No children's laughter, no footsteps running down the hall, just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. I thought about everything I'd just said, everything she'd written down, the way she'd phrased her questions, the way my answers, no matter how accurate, could be twisted. At the time, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not anger, not fear, something colder. Clarity. My daughter-in-law wasn't trying to prove I was dangerous. She was trying to make me look dangerous, to create a paper trail that would follow me, that would justify removing me quietly, officially, without ever having to prove I'd done anything wrong. And the system, designed to protect children, was helping her do it. The phone rang that evening. My son. Mom, he said. His voice was strained, tired. We need to talk. About what? About this situation, about the CPS visit, about everything that's happening. I waited. She's not trying to hurt you, he said. She's trying to protect the kids. Can't you see that? What is she protecting them from? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, from confusion, from mixed messages, from having to choose between the adults in their lives. I've never asked them to choose. But they feel it, he said. The tension, the conflict, it affects them. I closed my eyes. And removing me entirely solves that? It simplifies it. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. It gives them one clear structure, one set of rules, consistency. Even if it means losing their grandmother? You're not being removed, he said. Just boundaries, clear ones, for everyone's sake. I understood then. He'd chosen, not consciously, perhaps, but through exhaustion, through the path of least resistance, through the belief that keeping peace with his wife was the same as doing what was right. I see, I said. Mom, I hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I sat in the darkening house and let the silence wrap around me like a blanket. At the time, I thought I was being erased. Systematically, completely. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. Looking back now, I realized I was wrong. There was one thing left, one piece I hadn't used yet. Not because I didn't have it, but because I'd been saving it, waiting for the moment when it would matter most. And that moment, I understood now, was coming. The next morning, I made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, not to Margaret, to someone I hadn't spoken to in months, the school counselor. When she answered, I said, I'm Eleanor Whitman. You received a letter about me several weeks ago, concerns about my involvement with my grandchildren. Yes, she said cautiously, I remember. I'd like to schedule a meeting. I said, "and I'd like the children present." There was a pause. "That's highly irregular." "I know," I said, "but I think they deserve to hear the truth. All of it. Not the version they've been told, not the version designed to protect them from something that isn't real." "Mrs. Whitman, will you arrange it?" I asked, "or should I contact the principal directly?" Another pause, longer this time. Then, carefully, she said, "I'll see what I can do." I hung up and stared at the phone. At the time, I didn't know if she'd actually arranged the meeting, but I knew one thing with certainty. If they wanted to remove me from my grandchildren's lives, they would have to do it in front of them. And when that happened, I would make sure the children saw exactly what was being taken away. Not a confused old woman, but the truth. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 3:30. The school counselor's office. Small. Neutral territory. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting area outside. The chairs were too small, built for children. My knees pressed against the low table in front of me. I could hear voices through the door. My daughter-in-law, the counselor. I couldn't make out words, but I recognized the rhythm. Calm, measured, explanatory. At the time, I felt my stomach tighten. I'd requested this meeting, but I didn't know if I'd made the right choice, if exposing everything in front of the children would help or hurt. Looking back now, I understand it was the only choice left, because silence in a room full of witnesses becomes something different. It becomes a statement. The door opened. The counselor appeared. Miss Chen, mid-40s, glasses, a practiced expression of professional concern. "Mrs. Whitman," she said, "thank you for coming. Please, come in." I stood. My legs felt unsteady, but I walked forward without hesitation. Inside, my daughter-in-law was seated on the left side of a round table, my son beside her. Both children sat between them. My grandson was 9 now, tall for his age. My granddaughter was 11. She looked up when I entered, then quickly looked away. The counselor gestured to an empty chair across from them. "Please sit." I did. The table was small enough that we were all close. Too close. I could see my daughter-in-law's hands folded neatly in her lap. No tension visible. Perfectly composed. Miss Chun cleared her throat. "I want to establish some ground rules before we begin. This is a mediation, not a trial. Everyone will have a chance to speak. We're here to find clarity, not assign blame." I nodded. My daughter-in-law smiled slightly. Agreeable. Cooperative. "Mrs. Whitman," Miss Chen continued, "you requested this meeting. Would you like to start by explaining why?" I looked at the children. My grandson was staring at the table. My granddaughter's jaw was tight. She looked older suddenly, more guarded. "I wanted them to hear the truth," I said, directly, not filtered through anyone else's interpretation. "What truth?" Miss Chen asked gently. "That I've been removed from their lives based on accusations that are contradicted by documented evidence." My daughter-in-law shifted slightly. "Mrs. Whitman, no one has removed you. We've simply established healthier boundaries." There it was, the pivot, the reframe. Removing me became establishing boundaries. Control became health. "Boundaries that include filing a CPS report," I said, not accusatory, just factual. The counselor's eyes widened slightly. "I wasn't aware of that." "It was filed last week," I said, following a series of other institutional complaints, HOA petitions, letters to this office, all containing language that frames my care as interference. I pulled out a folder, the same one I'd been carrying for weeks. I placed it on the table.
This contains every interaction I've had with these children over the past 3 years, every request for help, every permission given, every thank you received. It also contains every accusation made against me, side by side. I opened it, turned it so everyone could see. I'm not asking you to choose sides. I'm asking you to see the pattern.
At the time, I wasn't sure if anyone was listening. The room felt suspended, frozen. Then my granddaughter spoke. "What accusations?" Her voice was small but clear. My daughter-in-law turned to her quickly. "Sweetheart, this is complicated, adult business." "What accusations?" my granddaughter repeated, louder this time. The counselor looked uncertain. "Perhaps we should—" "She deserves to know," I said. I looked at my granddaughter directly. "Your mother believes I've been confusing you, undermining your authority, creating dependency. That's not—" My daughter-in-law started, but I continued. "She believes the amount of time I spent with you was inappropriate, that the gifts I gave you were manipulative, that my presence in your life created problems." My granddaughter's face changed, not confusion, recognition. "You mean, like when Mom said we couldn't stay at your house anymore because you didn't respect her rules?" Silence. "Or when she said you forgot to return my field trip form, and that's why I almost couldn't go?" My daughter-in-law's composure cracked slightly. "That's not exactly—" "But Grandma gave me the form," my granddaughter said. "I remember. She handed it to Mrs. Patterson directly. I was there." Looking back now, I realized that was the moment. Not when I presented evidence, but when the children did, when their memory contradicted the story that had been carefully constructed.
My grandson spoke next, quieter. "Mom said Grandma was getting confused, that old people forget things, that we needed to be patient with her." I felt something twist in my chest. Not anger, something deeper. "I'm not confused," I said gently. "I keep records. I always have. It's how I worked for 40 years. I turned to the next page in the folder, the email chain about picking them up from school. "Your mother asked me to help. I said yes. Then later she told the HOA board I'd offered without permission, that I was overstepping." I showed them the full exchange, complete, unedited. My son was staring at the pages. His face had gone pale. "He didn't know," he said quietly. My daughter-in-law's voice sharpened. "This isn't productive. We're dredging up misunderstandings, reinterpreting normal communication." "Normal communication doesn't require CPS involvement," Miss Chen said. Her tone had shifted, less neutral now, more direct. My daughter-in-law turned to her. "I filed that report out of genuine concern. Mrs. Whitman has been exhibiting signs of—" "Of what?" I asked, still calm, still quiet. She hesitated, then said, "Memory issues, boundary confusion, obsessive documentation." "Obsessive documentation," I repeated. I pulled out another section, like keeping copies of thank you notes your children wrote me, like saving the drawing your son made when he stayed with me after his bad day at school. I placed the drawing on the table, the stick figure grandmother with a book, "I love Grandma" written in crooked letters. My grandson's eyes filled. He looked at his mother. "You said Grandma didn't care about us anymore, that she was too busy." My daughter-in-law's face hardened. "I said we needed space. That's different." "You said she was dangerous," my granddaughter said. Her voice was shaking now. "You told Dad she couldn't be trusted, that we needed protection."
I never said dangerous. You said it to the counselor, my granddaughter continued. I heard you, outside this office. You said Grandma was a risk we couldn't afford to take. The room went silent. At the time, I watched my daughter-in-law's face. The mask was still there, but thinner now, translucent. I could see the calculation underneath, the recalibration. She turned to Miss Chen. If we're going to use children's interpretations as evidence, this becomes impossible. They don't understand context, nuance. They hear fragments and build narratives. Like you did? I asked. Her eyes snapped to me. Excuse me? You took fragments of truth, dates, times, actions, and you built a narrative around them, but you removed the context, the requests, the permissions, the relationship that existed before you decided it was a problem. I leaned forward slightly. You said the children should know the truth, facts over feelings. Those were your words. I pulled out one more document, the letter she'd written to Miss Chen weeks ago, the one I'd found in her folder. This is what you wrote. Children deserve honest information about the adults in their lives, even when it's uncomfortable. You wrote that. I slid the letter across the table. So here's honest information. You've been systematically removing me from their lives, not because I was harmful, but because I was inconvenient, because I remembered things you wanted forgotten, because I documented things you wanted to deny. My daughter-in-law's hand trembled slightly, just once, then stilled. This is vindictive, she said. Her voice was quieter now. You're punishing me for trying to protect my children. No, I said. I'm using your own standard, the one you set. Facts over feelings, truth over comfort. I turned to the children. I love you both. I always have. I kept every note you wrote me, every drawing, every photo, not because I was obsessive, but because you mattered. You still matter. My granddaughter was crying now, silent tears running down her face. I didn't want to remove you, I said. I wanted to stay, but your mother made that impossible, and rather than argue with her, I decided let the truth argue for itself. My daughter-in-law left, alone. The door closed with a soft click. We sat in the office for another hour, talking. The children asked questions. I answered them, honestly, without framing, without spin. Ms. Chen took notes. My son sat quietly, reading through the documents I'd brought, his face unreadable. When we finally left, my granddaughter hugged me, hard, like she was afraid I'd disappear. "Are you coming back?" she whispered. At the time, I didn't know how to answer, because coming back meant more than just seeing them. It meant undoing months of damage, of rebuilding trust, of navigating a family that had fractured in ways I couldn't fully repair. "I'm here," I told her. "I've always been here." That night, my phone rang, my daughter-in-law's number. I stared at it for a long moment before answering. Her voice, when she spoke, was different. Colder. More calculated. And I knew with absolute certainty that what she said next would determine whether this ended or whether it was only beginning. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to hear my own breathing first, steady, controlled, a reminder that I was no longer the woman who turned away in silence. "Yes," I said. "We need to talk." Her voice was flat, stripped of the warmth she used in public. No more pretense. "I'm listening." "Not on the phone," she said. "In person. Tomorrow morning. Your house." At the time, I felt something shift in my chest, a warning. She'd lost control in front of witnesses. Now she wanted privacy, a space where there would be no documentation, no third parties. Looking back now, I understand she was offering one last negotiation, a chance to rewrite the ending before it became permanent. 9 o'clock, I said. She hung up without confirming. I didn't sleep that night, not from anxiety, from preparation. I thought through every possible approach she might take: apology disguised as explanation, threat disguised as concern, an offer of reconciliation that would require me to erase what had happened. By morning, I knew what I would and wouldn't accept. I wrote it down, not because I needed notes, but because writing makes things real, binding. She arrived exactly at 9. I heard her car pull into the driveway, the door shut with a crisp click, footsteps on the walkway, deliberate, unhurried. I opened the door before she knocked. She was dressed simply: jeans, a sweater, no makeup. It was a calculated choice. She wanted to look vulnerable, human, like someone who'd been misunderstood. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. I stepped aside. She came in. I gestured to the living room. We sat across from each other, the same positions we'd been in dozens of times before, but the air between us was different now, colder. She folded her hands in her lap. "I want to apologize." I waited. "I let fear guide me," she continued. Fear that the children were being pulled in too many directions, that they couldn't handle complexity. I thought I was simplifying their lives, making things easier. It was a good opening, reasonable, self-aware, almost believable. "But you weren't simplifying," I said. "You were erasing." Her jaw tightened slightly. "That wasn't my intention." "Intention doesn't matter," I said. "Only impact does. You taught me that." She looked at me differently then, reassessing. "What do you want?" I said. "Honesty. Not performance, not strategy, just the truth about why you did this." At the time, I didn't expect her to answer, but she did. "Because you remembered," she said. Her voice was quieter now, almost tired. "You remembered every conversation, every promise, every inconsistency, and you wrote it all down." She looked at her hands. "I couldn't control the narrative when you had documentation, when you could prove I'd asked for help and then claimed you'd overstepped, when you had evidence that contradicted the story I needed people to believe." "Why did you need them to believe it?" I asked. "Because if they didn't," she said slowly, "I'd have to admit I made mistakes, that I asked for too much, that I resented you for being there when I couldn't be, that the children loved you in a way that had nothing to do with me." It was the first honest thing she'd said in months, maybe years. "You tried to make me disappear because my presence reminded you of your limitations." She didn't deny it. We sat in silence for a moment. Not the old silence, the kind that had always made me shrink. This was different, heavier, more truthful. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on you," I said. "I'm not asking you to pretend this didn't happen. I'm not asking for an apology you don't mean. But I need boundaries, real ones, not the kind that erase me, the kind that define how we coexist." She nodded slowly. "What boundaries?" I said. "I see the children, regularly, without supervision, without having to ask permission every time as if I'm a stranger. And if I refuse? Then we continue as we are, with documentation, with institutional oversight, with the children knowing exactly what you did and why. Her face hardened. You'd weaponize them. No, I said. I'd let them remember. There's a difference. She stood, walked to the window, looked out at the street. When she spoke again, her voice was different, flatter, more resigned. I can't undo what I've done. The reports, the petitions, the CPS filing, those are on record. I know. Some will believe I had reasons, even if those reasons weren't true. Some will, I agreed, but the children won't. And eventually, that's what matters. She turned to face me. You think you've won? No, I said. I think we've both lost something. But I'm not interested in winning anymore. I'm interested in existing, without having to justify myself to you. She left shortly after. No dramatic exit, no final threats, just a quiet acknowledgement that the terms had changed, that the power she'd held through silence and institutional manipulation had shifted. At the time, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not relief, exactly, but space. Room to breathe without constantly defending my presence. Looking back now, I understand that was what I'd been fighting for all along. Not vindication, not revenge, just the right to exist in my grandchildren's lives without being redefined, reframed, erased. The children came over the following weekend. My son dropped them off. He stayed for a few minutes, awkward, uncertain how to navigate this new configuration. We didn't talk about what had happened, not directly, but he saw the photographs on the mantel, the drawings on the refrigerator, the evidence that I'd never actually left, just been pushed into the margins. He said finally, I'm sorry. I should have asked more questions. Yes, I said, you should have. He nodded. No excuses, no explanations, just acknowledgement. After he left, I made lunch for the children, sandwiches, apple slices, their favorite cookies. We ate at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd spread out years of documentation, where I'd prepared my case. My granddaughter asked if she could stay the night. I said yes. My grandson asked if we could read together before bed, like we used to. I said yes to that too. That evening, I tucked them in, closed their doors gently, and stood in the hallway for a long moment. The house felt different. Quieter, yes, but not the empty quiet I'd endured for months. This was the quiet of presence, of safety, of a space that belonged to all of us. Later that night, I opened the closet where I'd kept the box of documents, the binders, the evidence I'd collected. I didn't throw them away. I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I never would be. But I moved them to a higher shelf, out of sight, still there if needed, but no longer the center of everything. I went back downstairs and made tea, sat at the kitchen table in the dark. The only light came from the street lamp outside. It cast long shadows across the floor. At the time, I thought about the woman I'd been months ago, the one who turned away when she was insulted, who'd believed silence was dignity, who thought endurance was strength. Looking back now, I see her differently. She wasn't weak. She was waiting, gathering, preparing for the moment when silence would stop protecting others and start protecting her. Dignity, I learned, isn't given, it's maintained, sometimes loudly, sometimes with evidence and witnesses, and the kind of precision that makes lies impossible to sustain. But mostly, it's maintained through the quiet choice to not disappear, to not let someone else define the shape of your existence. I am still quiet, But it's a different quiet now, one with edges, with intention, with the knowledge that I don't need anyone's permission to take up space. The children are upstairs, safe, sleeping. Tomorrow they'll wake up and we'll have breakfast together. We'll talk about ordinary things, school, friends, projects. No one will question my right to be here. No one will document my presence as evidence of instability. No one will reframe my love as interference. Because I've established something stronger than rules or petitions or institutional oversight. I've established the truth, and truth, once made visible, is very hard to erase. The phone rang once more that week. My daughter-in-law. Brief, professional. "The children want to visit next weekend," she said. "I'm confirming that works for you." "It does," I said. "Fine, I'll drop them off Saturday morning." She hung up. No apology, no warmth, but also no accusations, no restrictions, no battle. Just logistics, coordination, the mechanics of coexistence. At the time, I wondered if this was victory, if the absence of conflict meant I'd won something worth winning. Looking back now, I understand that victory was never the goal. Survival was. The ability to continue existing without constantly proving I deserved to. And I'd achieved that, not through rage or theatrics or tearing anyone down, but through patience, through documentation, through the slow, methodical accumulation of truth. I still keep paper. I still write things down. I still date and file and organize. Not because I expect another battle, but because it's who I am, a woman who believes that memory bends, but records don't, that silence can be strategic, that sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest truths. The house is peaceful now, not empty, not silent in the way that erases, but full of a different kind of quiet, the kind that holds space for everyone, including me. I made it through, not unscathed, not unchanged, but intact, with my dignity maintained, my relationships preserved, my presence no longer up for debate. And when my granddaughter asks me years from now what I learned from all of this, I'll tell her something simple: that love is not the same as peace, that boundaries are not the same as exile, that silence is not the same as absence, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to disappear, even when someone is doing everything they can to make you invisible. I am still here, and that, in the end, was all I needed to be.